super stoked here with one of my favorite authors, Dr. William Lopez, aka Bill. And I initially met him because early on, I think it was 2013, he was out doing his PhD research, I believe, or at least studying like the effects of immigration raids on the community. And so he went around and interviewed a bunch of people here in Washtenaw County. And then during the middle of that research, there was a huge immigration raid here in Washtenaw County that just completely shocked the community. I'm talking earthquake, tsunami, you name it. My office went crazy off the hook phone calls because immigration came in and they convinced the Washtenaw County Sheriff to use the SWAT team to do a raid. And ICE basically spent all day stopping anyone who was brown or Latino, asking them for their documents. And if they didn't present them, they're putting them in immigration jail. Then Bill went after the fact and interviewed many people in the community and a lot of these same people that he'd interviewed before. And so we could realistically see the difference between before and after of the effects of immigration raids. He wrote a book about that, but what's even cooler is he wrote another book more recently, which I recently finished. And I'm going to let Bill talk more about himself and just specifically what brought him to write this most recent book, Raiding the Heartland. So go ahead.
Sure. Well, thanks, Brad, and thanks everyone for joining both online and in person. It's a serious time to think about immigration, right? I mean, we see everything that's going on in Minneapolis, certainly throughout the country, but all eyes on Minneapolis right now. And we are forced to think about where our country is headed. I'm glad that Brad started with the story of the immigration raid that happened in our community in 2013. One of the things, you used the words disaster, and you said like a tsunami, right, to describe the impacts in the community. And when I wrote the book, Raiding the Heartland, and what we did in this book, I spoke with folks throughout the country communities who responded to large-scale worksite raids. So these were raids even bigger than the one that we had in Ann Arbor, in Washtenaw County, and actually folks compared raids to natural disasters all the time. So the fact that you said, disaster, I always heard these comparisons to tornadoes, right, and to earthquakes, and to even forest fires, and why? Because the impacts of immigration enforcement don't just impact the person who's deported, or even in our case, half a dozen men who were deported, but there's ripple effects, just like there is with a hurricane or an earthquake or a tornado, throughout the family and throughout the community. And lots of what I took away from that lesson is that in order to talk about immigration, in order to talk about deportation, we can't only look at the climbing number of folks who are deported because it misses so much of the story. Every dot on that climbing graph of folks who are being deported, people who are impacted by it, often spouses, often wives, certainly children. But then these spillover effects also include places like schools and churches, which we'll talk a little bit about today. So thanks for inviting me. Thanks to everyone to be here. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. I think about this from a public health perspective, both how does it impact people's bodies to be deported or know folks who are deported? How does it make them sick is one way I talk about it. And public health is all about how we stay healthy, and we stay healthy by being with people we love. And deportation is fundamentally about fracturing these relationships. I'm not on all the social media platforms that Brad is on. I love to see them though and see folks across them. On Instagram, I'm Dr. Lopez on immigration, so happy to meet more folks on there as well.
So I loved both your books. A lot of the people who are watching us on social media haven't read Raiding the Heartland. What raids did you study and where were they? Meaning what states were
Sure. Yeah, so in Raiding the Heartland, we went to all 6 locations in which large-scale worksite raids happened in 2018. Now, something else really important was happening in 2018. The family separation crisis at the border, which we remember, right? And while everyone was looking at the U.S.-Mexico border, it's my home state of Texas, so I appreciate when eyes are on the U.S.-Mexico border. What we often missed is that these raids were happening in quiet, rural, Midwestern towns like we have in Michigan. I would probably say like we see in Minnesota. So we went to 6 locations. We went to O'Neill, Nebraska, Sandusky and Salem, Ohio, Bean Station, Tennessee, Sumner, Texas, and Mount Pleasant, Iowa. And these places had a few things in common. One is that they're often predominantly white spaces and sometimes predominantly Republican spaces, right? So we see that these raids often happened in places in which there weren't as many Latinos or immigrants, and thus there wasn't as much immediate of a reaction. So communities had to find other ways to react, often when they may not have had the same connection and known someone who was arrested or deported. I appreciate the questions coming in. I definitely see, can we talk about the military and military presence? We'll do a little more discussion about the books and then answer some of these questions. Please feel free to send some more. Please, in the audience, feel free to let us know when you have some too.
Yeah, and so it's really interesting because between Bill and me, our experience with dealing with the impacts of an ICE raid is very unique. He literally met with people, researched, scientifically studied the effects of a raid. Me, from the legal perspective, I saw how legally, right, a raid works, both from the ICE perspective, from the immigrant perspective, from the family perspective. And what Bill and I both share in common was seeing the emotion, because ICE raids trigger emotion in everyone, period. Right? So, in fact, my favorite part of your book, Bill, was in the acknowledgement section. You write, grief and rage inspired this book, but love and community brought it to fruition. What do you think about that statement?
Yeah, I'm on a less serious note, when you're an author, it's often funny to see what words people pick out of your book because you've written thousands and you never know which 5 in a row people are going to pick out. So it's even scarier to know that people read the acknowledgments. I appreciate that. The book did come from grief and rage because deportation, as you said, it's traumatizing and it makes me effing angry, right? To see this happen to people we love, to people I would say are part of my community. It makes me angry. But from this darkness are always stories of light. And one of the things I talk about that I'm often shocked by is in the aftermath of these raids, you're getting together, often with people you've met for the first time, sometimes with family members, people you love. You might be enjoying a meal, you're strategizing about what to do next, and sometimes somebody will say something funny and you'll find yourself laughing. And despite all the trauma, you realize there's this bond because we're people from a community who wants the same thing, and that is we want to wake up and see our family with us the next day. So part of what I want to do in my work is I understand the importance of showing the mechanisms of deportation, right? This is how this machine works. And as Brad said, he knows the intricacies on the single individual level on an immigration case in a way I never will. And an important complement to that is how it works in a mass deportation campaign kind of space that Trump is advocating. But this runs the risk of focusing only on the sad parts and not on only on the deportation and sad parts, and not on the moments of joy in life and community building that happens after. It's one of the reasons I really like the title of the book and so much, An American Story of Deportation and Resistance, because both are part of that American story. Through all presidencies, as you know well, right, Democrat and Republican, deportation has been a part of that story. And whenever there is a deportation, resistance is also a part of that story because nobody lets their neighbor, their father, their uncle, their mother get removed without doing something about it. These are the stories that are so often missed. And these are also the stories emerging out of Minnesota right now, which again, we find inspiring despite the darkness they're coming from.
Yeah. So what kinds of resistance have you seen, and what types of resistance are we seeing right now?
Yeah, I'll tell you one of my favorite, resistance strategies that I saw after this. So we went to a school in Bean Station, Tennessee. Rather, Bean Station is where the raid took place, and we went to a school in Morristown, which is a little bit bigger town right next to it. Most of the population who worked in Bean Station, most of the undocumented folks who worked in Bean Station lived in Morristown. So 98 people were taken in this raid of a meatpacking plant, right? So a fairly big raid, I would say by our standards here, an enormous raid. We saw the next day in Morristown, generally there are 75 kids absent any given day in that district. The day after the raid, there were 500 students absent. Most of them were Latino students. So on a population level in public health, we talk a lot about population health. Like, what does this look like for a whole city, state, region, community, etc. On a population level, you start to see these gaps in achievement where white students will do better and go to school more than Latino students because their parents can't take them, because they've lost a driver, or because they're scared to leave their homes, right? So going back to like, what are some of the strategies we see? Resistance strategies is one way to say it afterwards. The teachers in those schools, and we saw the same thing in Texas, in an area near Sumner, Texas. Many of the teachers in Sumner, they drove to the homes of every single student who didn't show up to make sure they were okay. Every single student. One of the things that's easy to miss, Brad, is that when, for many low-income families, they get their meals at school. So after deportation, so many families go without food for a reason many may miss is that they're not going to school. So those teachers packed bags of food and delivered them to every single one of the homes of those students, right? And this is the kind of thing that's often missed on the news because we're focusing appropriately on protest marches and the prevention of deportation, right? Again, it's entirely appropriate to strategize here and to focus on these things in the media, but it often does come at the expense of what we do to take care of our neighbor in the aftermath of deportation.
So what, I guess, would you say, what does it look like to prevent deportation versus to care for those who are left behind?
Yeah, it's a great question and a good way to kind of divide it, right? So we see a lot of strategies. We're thinking even in Minnesota that we're seeing now. One of the things we're noticing is Greg Bovino, Border Patrol chief, right, has been stationed there and is walking to fill up his vehicle and going into gas stations, and crowds are gathering around him. Everywhere he goes, horns are honking and people are not letting him have a quiet moment, and everyone is alerted to his presence, right? This I would kind of put in the preventing deportation strategy box. Like, here is where deportations might happen. Avoid this area. The proliferation of whistles is another way that we're alerting our communities to the presence of ICE, right? It's not violent. It's just, this, just like honking horns, whistles are calling attention to the area so that the folks who want to scatter to get away from the area can do so, right? This is great. These kind of strategies have proven to be successful in Minnesota in ways that we were beginning to see in places like Chicago and DC. But the other side of this is that some deportations do happen, or when they're avoided, but they're avoided in a slightly different ways. And we refer to this as community care, one of the phrases we use in public health, right? Community care. And it's very simply like checking in with your neighbor and seeing what kind of things you can do for that person, that family individually. And to give you some examples, people often need their children taken to school. As I referenced, often Latino children won't be able to go to school, so dropping kids off. In Minnesota, we've seen so many donated groceries and organized food pantries, and this is something we saw throughout the country in this work. Churches were often filled with food donations, right? Because families not only were scared to leave the home, but often lost a breadwinner. Deportation, as you know, often takes a breadwinner, takes the financial provider.
Yeah, and it really, when there's a raid, adapt and react, both from what Bill was talking about, but also from the legal perspective, right? So Donald Trump clearly is doing a lot of raids. He also made, for example, this rule that says, oh, if you enter without a visa, you're not eligible for bond, so you're going to stay in jail. And his rule pretty much is if you're picked up and you're out of status, you're going to jail. And then that increases the chance of deportation. So what do we do as lawyers? We have to adapt and react. So we, when I say we, immigration lawyers across the nation have started filing habeas corpus federal lawsuits where we're suing the administration in federal court, we're suing ICE, we're suing the immigration court saying, you know what, Donald Trump is wrong because he is literally not following the law. And we know as lawyers that federal judges have more power than an immigration judge or an ICE officer with regards to the interpretation of the law. And we're actually becoming very successful nationwide in doing these lawsuits to force the immigration court to offer bond hearings on these cases. The frustrating thing is we literally, for each person in jail, have to sue all these branches of the government, and it's a tremendous volume of work simply at the end of the case to win the right to have a bond hearing where the immigration judge may or may not give bond. So it's not, an absolute solution, but it's one of those things where it's like we just have to adapt and react with what we have to work with.
Mm-hmm. And before we go on to the next question, I think part of what I hear in you saying this, right, is that there are strengths and strategies in all of these different groups and in all these different sectors, right? The legal sector, the religious sector, the organizing sector. And there's challenges, like you're saying, sometimes legally, it's an incredible volume of work for what may seem like a single individual. That is nonetheless important, right? Just as blowing whistles and honking horns at Greg Bovino is super important as well. But once the person is detained, you need someone like a lawyer, right? So part of what this often illustrates to me is that, over and over, I've seen there is no perfect resistance act. There is no perfect march to go to. There is no, perfect movement. There's lots of people in different roles doing the very best they can. And one of the reasons I love to see this and acknowledge this is because often folks feel as though they need to be superheroes and super knowledgeable and be lawyers for 2 decades or write a book right before you can do anything. And like nothing's farther from the truth, right? Movements are not based on people with this heightened skill set. They're based on everyone doing whatever they possibly can. Yeah. So I think happy to take some other questions. Great to see everyone again. Dr. Lopez on immigration on Instagram. So I still do use Twitter, so you can find me on Twitter as well.
Yeah. So one thing that both of us have done a lot in our career is gone to these communities in various locations, and a common meeting place are the churches and places of worship. Tell me a little bit about what have you seen as the role of churches during periods of mass deportation?
Yeah, this reminds me of a situation that we saw. We visited the site of a raid in Sumner, Texas. And this was, again, a work site raid. I believe it was over 100 folks were detained. And one of the advocates who did most of the organizing lived in a town, Tyler, over 100 miles away. And she was very well connected. And she heard about this raid. And she said, okay, we need more people there. Who do I know? I know someone who speaks Spanish in the media. She was an organizer. She knew another, I forget, there's one other person who was critical, perhaps a religious leader. And she said, okay, let's all go to Sumner. We have to see what's happening. And so they all stepped in their cars and they all drove, and they didn't know where they were going. They just started going. None of them had ever been to Sumner. And on the road, she started calling pastors, and she was like, there will be someone who lets me go. Let's find a church and let's get started. So one of the things I really took for granted is that churches, for many reasons, which I'll talk about in a second, are important, but they're also just known locations in some of what can be isolated towns, right? So you're coming from out of that town, or even if it's not a small town, you're coming from out of that town and you need a landmark, a church is a place you can go. They're also really, what do I want to say? They're useful for all these practical and logistical purposes. And what I mean by that is they have space to pull out a table and put on a printer. They have space for people to sit and take notes, right? So churches became really useful for this reason too, because those inside the churches would open their doors and welcome people and do something that I think is critical in the immigration movement. They would say, whatever you need, go ahead, you can do it here, right? And they weren't trying to specialize. And it's something that as a researcher and an author, as someone who spent his whole life specializing, I came to appreciate more. They're like, the movement is born out of people saying, what do you need? And I can do that for you. The other thing that churches do, if I were to characterize, right, the 6 sites that we went to with one image or one item, I would actually say that it's packages of diapers. Everywhere I went, we saw packages of diapers because people would donate diapers because families did not have the money anymore to buy the necessities like food and diapers, right? But those diapers, just like the food, they needed somewhere to be dropped off. So this is where churches would also show up. Like, we have space, we have people, we have whatever skill set you need. We're really good at organizing and distributing things, right? And so people would bring stuff and they would distribute them, and folks knew that they could come to the church. The last reason is that they were just seen appropriately as safe space at the time, right? And so we know this sensitive location memorandum has been, I think revoked is the word, by the current administration. So it's not officially a sensitive, has the defense of a sensitive location anymore. And you could, help me with the language. But at the time it was, or at least at the time it was seen as such. So folks go into churches to find the safety behind those walls too.
So keep the questions coming. There is one person that wants to see the book again. It's also on my Facebook. If you do at Immigration Law PLLC, or my name's Brad Thompson, THOMSON. There's a QR code that you can actually get straight to Amazon to purchase the book as well too. So I know both of us are really inspired by the families, but specifically the children that we meet and interact with in our professional capacity. Tell me about how immigration raids affect children, specifically if mom or dad is put in jail. What happens?
Yeah, I've seen so many impacts of deportation and arrests on children. I don't, my mind immediately goes to, first name is Liam, 5-year-old who was arrested or detained in Minneapolis. And my heart absolutely breaks when I see images of a 5-year-old being detained. And I'm sure you have this experience, but sometimes there's particular cases or situations that really, really get you. And this is one that really tore me up. Generally, one thing you see among children is I've heard some version of, I just never know when my parent is going to be back again. In my first book, actually an individual Brad knew actually was detained for, something like 3 months, 6 months, and they thought he was going to be deported. His children were a little older than mine, but much younger at the time. He's maybe 10, I would say. And so his dad gets out of detention for a bit when they pay his bond. His dad comes home, and he was telling me this story. His father was telling me this story, and he said, my son, after I got out of detention, he didn't go back to sleep in his own room. He just slept by my side from then on. And he said, I want you to hold my hand as I fall asleep, Dad, because if you're holding my hand, nobody will be able to take you away from me. And that just, having children myself, having kids about the age of his kids or a little bit younger at the time, broke my heart to understand and think about what it's like to grow up as a child, never knowing if the parent who drops you off at school is going to be the parent who picks you up, or knowing that the administration is spending billions of dollars to remove your parents, or knowing that a portion of the country supports the removal of your parents, right? These are all things that as a society we have to process and deal with. But specifically for children, the weight of the unknown of the parent removal, at a minimum, and this sounds silly, but you cannot focus in school, going back to educational impacts, right? You can't focus or do well in school when you're worried about parent removal. Again, not the most important, but still certainly important. And we certainly see depression, anxiety. What the research actually shows is that RAIDs can impact a child differently, right? So depending on the kind of RAID, and there's a few things that influence that. This is a friend and colleague, Joanna Dreby, who did this research. One of the things that influences the outcomes for children is the proximity to the RAID. So did they witness it in the home or in the car, which is about as close as you can get? Did they see it from far away, like across the streets? Or did they hear about it, right? And not to say that there's a better, a healthier, a safer way to do it, only that as we see more and more RAIDs happen where the child is the witness, we know the impacts are going to be worse. And then the other thing that influences it is the actual, the content, the mechanism, the operation of the RAID, and how violent that is, right? So a request to leave the home that your father follows is very different than what we see often, and what we saw in the RAID, which is the use of chemical weapons or seeing your parent thrown on the ground. Again, not to argue there's a better or worse way to do this, only that we know that the way that it's being done now, with proximity to the child and parent being arrested, and a dangerous and violent arrest, is absolutely going to impact that child for the foreseeable future, if not the rest of their life.
Yeah. So one big difference between Trump administration number 1 versus Trump administration number 2, obviously we're in Trump administration number 2 right now, is the amount of females and mothers getting arrested. I didn't really see much of that going on in Trump administration number 1. Yes, it absolutely occurred, without a doubt. But it's much more prevalent now. And when I was reading your book, I know that you came across some instances, especially, for example, mothers who had young children who may have been nursing. Like, what happens in that situation?
Yeah, I think you're right. There used to be, under all previous presidents, and especially under President Obama, who also deported many people, but certainly under President Obama, there were priorities, right? Here were the folks who were deported first. Here are the folks who we would probably do something to delay or even waive their deportation. Among those folks were caretakers and often mothers. So I, like you, was very used to, even my language was the deportation of fathers and the deportation of, husbands, right? And with the removal of these priorities, meaning all undocumented folks are equally the priority of the administration, you don't just see men and husbands and uncles removed anymore. You see people, you even see teenagers, and you see people in school, again, which we'll see in Minneapolis, like high schoolers, right? Which didn't generally happen outside of this administration, be taken. What does this do? It creates, everyone is vulnerable, and this feeling of being hunted for removal, again, with an administration spending billions for removal, it's easy for folks to imagine this is not a safe state to live in, right? This is not a safe state of mind to live in. And that's absolutely what we see, is the depression and anxiety of living with that kind of feeling. That was your question was more about, what happens in a situation where there's a caretaker. A few things can happen to children when both parents are taken. One of the biggest fears, which I talk a little bit about in Raiding the Heartland, when both parents are undocumented, the biggest fear can be that the child will enter into the CPS system, right? Be taken by Child Protective Services, and that they won't get the child back because they're undocumented and because they're deported. And among the things you need to be able to get your child back after separation is presence in family court. But family court doesn't inherently take into account if you've been deported. So these parents aren't able to go to court to get their children back when they've been separated from them. So we see this double loss. We see this family separation, and then we see the impact of longer family separation in which a child can't be returned to their parents. This also just, one of the things we may want to think about is we often talk about what deportation as if it's the end, like as if the removal of the person is the last time we see them and talk about them, right? In writing the book, one of the things that I really needed to learn to do was how to write about absence. When you write, you generally write presence. There were the three characters there, and you describe those characters, but so much of life involving deportation is learning to think about presence, absence, and how to still have relationships across that absence, right? How do you have relationships with your father in Honduras or your mother back in Mexico while you're still in the US? Because these are the situations that happen. And going back to the beginning of our conversation, right, when we're thinking about how to provide community care, yes, prevention of deportation is critical, and I hope attention continues to go to how do we prevent this, and how do we care for those who are left behind. And part of that is how do we facilitate relationships across borders, right? As part of the movement, which we don't talk about quite as much. I love the questions coming. I see someone who's an educator says they agree with the impacts of education. I always talk about one of the things we do in public health. Our job is to make something that people don't really know about. We make it evident, so evident that people just can't, that of course it seemed like it was something they always knew, right? This is kind of how the impacts of deportation on education are. People don't necessarily think of it, but worksite raids happen between the hours of 9 and 5 because that's when people are at work. With very few exceptions, that's when children are at school. So every single time these raids are happening during work, it's educators like those we see here who are explaining that the parents that drop the children off at school may not pick them up every single time. Like, I cannot overemphasize the role of educators who are impacted by mass deportation. And I continue to believe that after families themselves, it will be educators who experience the brunt of mass deportation. Thank you for your comment. And of course, thank you for teaching there too, for teaching students. Comments from people in the room? You have any questions?
While you're talking about teachers,
Sure.
My cousin at Christmas she's a teacher in Waterford and of elementary school, and these kids are like, they want to learn, they want to be, two of them from a family were absent, and they came in the next day and they're like, we're so sorry that we weren't at school. We were hiding under the bed and our dad was taken. And she's, and she's there to hold herself together for these kids. And so there's the heartbreak of it. And then there are all of these practical things. She has a student that she can visibly see the pain, physical pain. This child needs a dentist. The child needs to go to a dentist and can't work in school. They're in pain. They have multiple levels. And I know that there's a fear from your first book, Dr. Lopez, that if you go, you're going to be in the system, you're going to be found. Are there any resources either from retired dentists and doctors or students who have not yet taken an oath to report? Is there any way that there is or could be an infrastructure to get the help for these families that are feeling too fearful to get the help and the care that they need?
I want to say something on that too, because I deal with that on a regular basis in the work that I'm dealing with. And I think it's really community by community dependent. Some communities have tremendous resources available because there's a lot of people trying to help. And in some communities, there just aren't any resources So in terms of and there are a lot of people that want to help and aren't sure what to do, right? So that's one thing. If you're like, okay, well, I'm not an immigration lawyer, I'm not a teacher, but I want to help. It's like, well, maybe that's something that you can do is see how you can figure out what resources are available and connect people who have resources. That's a lot of what goes on, especially after these raids. I know with the raid here in Ypsilanti back in 2013, during the raid, and it was cold winter day, kind of similar to today, honestly, like freezing out. And ICE came in, raided this car like mechanic shop, and up above it was a residence where people were living. And they basically, after raiding and arresting all the men, the woman and children, they were like, this is not coded for living, like residential, you need to leave. And the moms didn't speak Spanish. They had kids. Their husbands just got arrested. It's like, where were they supposed to go? I mean, thank God for the community here in Washtenaw County that banded together, specifically Wicker, their response team, because they helped the people find hotels. But what if Wicker wasn't there? And guess what? These raids occur in places where there is no Wicker or other organizations to help out. So really, it's heartbreaking. It's really difficult. A lot of people in my profession burn out. Like, it's really hard to do this. I always call it like the 3-year rule. Like, if you can survive 3 years, then you have a very good chance to survive in this career, because so many people burn out in the first 3 years because of this. You see this like really heartbreaking stuff. There's been countless times in my career where I have literally tried my best to help children who are having suicidal ideations not commit suicide, right? My job as an immigration lawyer. But part of that is, okay, if there's a child or a teenager that's like, I'm going to kill myself, like, where can I help them find resources to, address those types of issues?
Mhm.
So obviously there's no perfect solution, but people who care, just communicating. It is kind of nice. There's having social media in terms of you can connect and communicate with people easier than it used to be. But definitely, if you live in a place where there are these types of organizations, asking the simple question like, ¿Cómo le puedo ayudar? That in Spanish means, in English is, how can I help? Right? That's probably the best thing someone can do if they're not sure what to do is, hey, what can I do to help? Right? And that's like a very good starting spot, because you will find someone at some point that needs help and will know how to utilize your strengths to help the community for the greater good.
Mhm.
So, and go ahead and
Sure.
from your perspective.
Yeah, so a good question, Jen. Thank you. Like, to start out, I'll highlight what you said is that when folks are scared of deportation, the ripple effects are always distrust in all other government systems, right? And sometimes the fear may not be related to an accurate, what do I want to say? Like, sometimes there's fear that going to the dentist may lead to deportation, even if that's not really the case, right? That you can usually do things like go to a dentist. But what we see is the gap between what's real and the feeling, on the ground. The feeling on the ground is what matters. And, what we see this mostly, this distrust between when Border Patrol is in an area, no one after the Border Patrol or ICE is there trusts the police. And this is why the police do not like when ICE and Border Patrol are in their communities, because they want that community trust. But too many folks on the ground, right? The man is the man is the man. And whether that's the man in the green uniform or the blue uniform, or unfortunately, people who often work in the government, there is that feeling of distrust, right? So our communities are healthiest when all of our neighbors are able to do things like get medical care, right? So what I often want folks to understand is that whether you know these individuals, undocumented folks, immigrants, whether you know them or not, the health of your community is impacted by this fear of deportation. and by policies like restricting driver's licenses, right? So believe it or not, it's much safer to drive when everybody can get a license and everyone can be insured, right? But these are policies and enforcement, mechanisms that impact everyone, whether you know it or not, or whether you reflected on it or not. The second thing Jen brought up is that it is often teachers counseling their students. So they're not only counseling their students from the trauma of losing a parent. One of the more complicated ones is that teachers often have to explain to their white students why their Latino classmates are gone. So it's not just a third of the class is gone; it's a particular third of the class. And these are hard conversations for teachers to have. One of the principal of the school that we went to in Morristown, she said, we saw that kids weren't eating, and I knew immediately I was going to feed them because, and I quote her. She says, where do you stop being a teacher? Right? Asking rhetorically, where do you stop being a teacher? Meaning you never really stop. You never just teach. You're always providing that extra level of care. For me, there's two things I draw from this. One is that all of our social problems, we're counting on our teachers to address, right? Whether it's mass deportation or whether it's school violence. The second is this attitude that teachers have. Where do you stop? You don't stop. You provide what you can. Is the fundamental attitude that does best in these organizing movements. Not I'm bringing in just my specialty, but as you said, I'm going to figure out how I can help, and I'm going to figure out what I can do and what I have, and then I'm going to share that, and I'm going to know you and you and you, and that's how a network starts.
Yeah. So I love this question, and I'm actually interested, Dr. Lopez, on if you have any insight on this. I know I have some insight, but the question is, how does ICE know who to go after? Like, how do they know where people are living, or are they just racial profiling people?
Yeah, Escobar, Melissa, that's a great question. Melissa, thank you for asking. So I'll go ahead and start if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So my opinions on ICE are very, very clear, right? So in what I'm about to say, again, I don't want to say that here's where ICE is great and here's where ICE is bad. That's not what I'm saying at all. I will say that in the previous administration, ICE would picking an individual or perhaps a couple of individuals, and while often violent, and even in the case that we saw used chemical weapons, right, between ICE and the sheriff's office, they maintained that violence into a home. Again, I wrote about how terrible that is, but it's still different than what we see now, which is not the guardrail of a particular individual, nor the guardrail of confining it to a home or a car, right? So in answer to your question, now ICE is absolutely engaging in racial profiling. We've known it for a fact for a long time, right? So this is not just Bill and Brad's opinion. There was a suit in Ohio of the Border Patrol in Ohio in which there was evidence and a judge agreed that Ohio Border Patrol was engaging in racial profiling, right? We know this. We also know from, I believe it was before Minneapolis, but Border Patrol and ICE wanted the Supreme Court to ask the Supreme Court and got permission that your accent and your skin color can be used as part of the package that they're assessing when they need reasonable probable cause. There we go. Slipped my mind. Probable cause, right? It didn't used to be allowed to use accent and skin color as part of probable cause, but it is now. The fact that ICE and Border Patrol are asking for permission shows that that's both what they're doing and what they plan to do. So, and even I would say before current day, what we saw in the raid in 2013, there was a single target for that raid, but about a dozen people got arrested because they all fit the profile of the individual. And both Brad and I know that fitting the profile means they matched gender and they matched race. What do I mean by that? It was Latino men, right? Racial profiling is fundamental to the work of ICE and Border Patrol. What would you say?
Yeah, the Supreme Court has legalized it 100%. It's wrong, but now the US government says racial profiling by ICE agents is legal. Here's a fact. I had a client in my office today who entered without a visa, spent 3 months in one of the biggest immigration jails in the country, for sure top 10, maybe top 5, in North Lake Processing Center in Baldwin. He was there for 3 months. I did one of those habeas lawsuits to get him out, but he said, you know, there was, because he knew the numbers because he was working in the kitchen. There was approximately 1,750 immigrants in that jail for those 3 months. Like, it was more or less, you know, sometimes it'd be a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. While he was there, he said 99% Latino. Right? How is that possible if there isn't racial profiling by ICE agents? So absolutely, it's going on. Now, what ICE traditionally would do is look for someone who had a criminal record or had an order of deportation, and then they would go and look for that person at their residence, or supposedly they might get a tip or at their work, and then anyone else who looks Latino, then they ask them for their, you know, paperwork, and if they didn't have it, then they'd arrest them. They call them, you know, collaterals. And so, but yeah, that's why people are so enraged right now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's getting very confrontational because it's happening. The U.S. government has legalized it. A lot of people support it, and obviously a lot of people hate it. So it's really dividing our country on, you know, invoking that emotion. And just on top of that, that client that I had in today in my office, they didn't have a warrant for him, and he was in a car. And he has, if it's just, ICE typically only has administrative warrants, which do not allow to, for example, enter a car if the person is staying silent. And ICE shattered the window of the car, pulled my client out of the car, right? So he had no criminal record. This is like ICE agents right now are more aggressive than I've ever seen in my career by far. And it's kind of really become a us versus them mentality. So, and it's almost like, you know, people talk about the protesters having this mob mentality, but I also see the same thing going on with the ICE officers. There was 7 vehicles that surrounded my client's car, right? And more agents than that. And they were threatening him, even though he had a constitutional right to stay silent. It took me 3 months. It's federal lawsuit, you know, and at the bond hearing, so the federal judge was like, you have 5 days immigration to let him out of jail or offer him a bond hearing. Day 4, they offered him a bond hearing. And that was in the afternoon, so I had to prepare everything. Friday morning, or the next morning, we had the bond hearing, and the ICE attorney tried to say that my client wasn't cooperating with, and he's a flight risk and should be denied bond. Federal judge cut him off, said, did he have a warrant? The ICE attorney said no. He's like, that's it. I'm letting him out. I'm buying $3,000. So, and when I asked the client, okay, of those 1,750, how many people did you see over those 3 months get let out? He said 15. Right? So this is just what's going on all across the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so in response to a question here, what app are we on? Multiple: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram Live. On Instagram, I'm at Dr. Lopez and Immigration. You can also look up Brad Thompson on the other.
I'm on Facebook, and then my it's at Immigration Law PLLC for. I have a business, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and so all the platforms.
Yeah, great. Another question before we wrap up from our live audience.
I have a question from a legal strategy standpoint, and I know like everything's on fire, so you know
Mm-hmm.
how to have somebody focus on something that isn't helping an individual seems almost frivolous. But there was a meeting yesterday with the the people who are on the board for the DTW Airport, Willow Run Airport, where there are planes going out with people who may or may not have a legal, reason to be allowed to be removed from an airport on a plane. And there was a statement that was made by the board that, we don't have any contract with ICE, we don't have any contract with the government, as though that's the end of the story. The airlines do what they need to do. If they're not doing anything illegal, we do not interfere. And it's like, well, that middle part about anything illegal, if you don't have oversight, you check everybody's, the airports are checking, or, there is a check of everybody who goes in, their papers, their ID, their ticket and everything. And is there a potential kind of soft spot where where they could be sued for having this happen on their property? Is it just the airlines that would be responsible, or could there be something that would open up and make them think twice about having planes? Because Avelo, they stopped, but then it just goes to another. I mean, if there's a way to slow down or stop, at least the removal of people from their community to either Texas or who knows where after that. Is there any legal, that I know this is off the top of the head, but is that worth investigating either with the ACLU or somewhere in there?
So just from experience, I would say if that were to occur, then they would just, even if there was a lawsuit, that's something that with the resources that ICE has, they'll figure out an alternative route. If one airport's like, no, then so, and then I'm an immigration lawyer, so I don't know the legalities of specifically airport, and that type of thing. But
it brings up, I don't know the answer to that question exactly either, but it brings up something I think it's worth talking about too. We went with the family because the father was deported, and we helped the children visit the father, right? And the gate agent didn't quite know what was going on, and I could see the gate agent puzzling through what was our relationship to these children, right? And we had all the paperwork, of course. We were helping those children get with their deported father, and we didn't explain to the gate agent what was going on. But it's only a matter of time before that gate agent, in a year, knows that all these adults who are unrelated to the children that they're with are helping these children. These children are self-deporting, even though they're citizens. They're going to meet their father back home. And what really struck me about this is that gate agent is now part of this mass deportation machine too, right? So even though you're asking Jen about could we sue the airline, I think that is a different question. Part of the reason that, to go back to the rage and grief that started all of this, that I get angry about it, is because I hate the idea of a innocent gate agent and the innocent person who, all of these folks who are going to get sucked up in the activity of the deportation machine. Someone has to drive them, someone has to fly them, the hotels have to support the ICE agents, and we don't want to support this system, but many of us are going to get pulled into it if it keeps expanding. I don't know if you have any other questions. We're nearing the end. I love seeing so much activity here and online on the different platforms. This is a hard conversation to have it, a hard time to have it, but it's that's why it's so important. So thank you all for joining.
I always like to leave on a good note. I think that's how I have survived in my career. It's like there's a lot of things I have no control, but I see a lot of beautiful things and beautiful moments, and have met some beautiful people. What was the most beautiful thing about raiding the Heartland, or are there any beautiful moments that really stick out in your mind?
So many, and I'm glad you ended on such a good note. Like I said, the amount of times that you find yourself just smiling and laughing and inviting to people's houses far outnumber the tragic moments. Again, these happy moments are coming from this systematic, separation of our families. But nonetheless, there are moments that we should acknowledge. Some of my best friends I've both gone to these places with and, have maintained friendships with through the rest of my life. Like lots of wonderful relationships have come from these, from strategizing about how to fight against something, right? And I think these moments can certainly bring us together. We wish we had we come together under other circumstances, certainly, but given what's going on, yeah, organizing and all the growth that comes from it is one of the best things that can result from what's going on right now. So thank you for asking. Thanks for having me. Thanks for joining. Again, you're welcome to ask me questions on Instagram. I try to be pretty responsive to with questions I get there. Raiding the Heartland, an American story of deportation and resistance. Born September 23rd, so it's still relatively new. Hope to get some more of your thoughts on it as we go. And thanks again, Brad.
Yeah, and I saw there were some immigration questions that weren't really related. There were case-specific questions that weren't related to just our topic of discussion. I would love to help you out and answer those questions. Just reach out to me directly. You can just call me at the office. Or communicate me directly on social media. So, all right, y'all. I just want to say good night and thanks for joining. Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Good night.